Hereby I open this academic ceremony at Maastricht University. First of all, I welcome Marie-Laurence Tremblay. She will defend her academic thesis, which is entitled Lights, Camera, Action, Debrief, Designing Immersive Simulation for Novices to Promote Learning. I welcome all the members of the degree committee, and in particular the two supervisors, Professor Diana Dolmans. She is Professor of Innovative Learning Environments at Maastricht University, and Professor Jan-Joost Redhans. He is Professor of Innovative Curriculum Development, particularly in the field of human simulation. The 6 opponents I will introduce later during the ceremony. Welcome to all followers of the live stream, and I would like now to invite Mrs. Tremblay to present a summary of her thesis, and I wish you success in the coming hour. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Prorector. Share my screen. All right. So, dear Prorector, supervisors, members of the committee, colleagues, friends, and family online, over the next 15 minutes, I will give you an overview of the research that I have conducted over the last several years on instructional design of immersive simulation for novices in pharmacy. When training to become a healthcare professional, there's concern that practicing new techniques on real patients might actually harm them. So simulating these situations using simulated patient can be an interesting alternative for novices to practice their skills without fear of harming anyone. Now, over the years, we have developed numerous simulation methods and technology to achieve this goal, and among which we find immersive simulation. Simply put, immersive simulation is a simulation modality where learners practice their clinical skills in an environment that replicates a real clinical setting. So it looks and it feels just like it would in reality, but the patient in the scenario is not a real one. It can either be a mannequin or a simulated patient played by an actor, but everything else is just like in real life. And the physical environment is important to the scenario and is not just there to look good. So it provides a context for the situation, the when, the where, the how things should be done. For example, if you're understaffed or your internet connection is not working well that day, or you're in a loud environment, you might deal with the situation very differently than you would under different conditions. And it's not enough that learners practice their skills. They also need to reflect on their performance and try to analyze what they did well and what they can improve for future practice. So this analysis is called a debriefing and is usually facilitated by an expert in the field that can guide the discussion and help develop a plan for improvement. The use of immersive simulation has greatly expanded over the last decades, and specifically in undergraduate programs, which comes with certain challenges. Typically, these novice learners do not have a lot of experience, and they're easily overwhelmed by everything that's going on in a real clinical setting, which is often unpredictable. For them, everything is new, and everything is equally important, up to the way they dress, to the tasks that they're actually performing, to the number of people in the room. So what would be just another day at the job for an expert is actually quite challenging for such an inexperienced learner. And even when students are simply observing their peers perform, which is often the case in simulation, they can still be overwhelmed. And even though a good debriefing can partially compensate for a bad performance, if the learner is so overwhelmed by the situation that he misses all the important pieces of the puzzle, debriefing, however good it may be, can hardly bridge all the gaps. So it's therefore important to adapt the simulation to echo the learner's experience level and avoid overloading them with too much information. But really, how do we do that? How do we adjust a real situation to make it reachable for novice learner while maintaining its authenticity? Which features exactly are overwhelming for them, and where should we start? To approach this problem, there are different learning theories that can help us understand what's going on in our students' mind, and cognitive load theory is one of them. Cognitive load is the amount of information that the working memory holds at the same time. Now, the working memory has only a limited capacity. And so for learning to occur, it's important that the learner is not too distracted by irrelevant information and that the relevant information is not too complex to process. According to this theory, cognitive load will arise from the interactions between the learner, the learning task, and the learning environment in which it takes place. So this means that the overall cognitive load will be the result of the learner trying to perform a task in a dynamic environment. And these different interactions were at the center of my research. I had two overarching research questions that guided my study. The first one being, what are the effects of task and environmental complexity in immersive simulation for novices' learning experience? And the second one was how to support the learning experience when novices observe a peer perform in simulation. To answer these questions, I set out 4 experimental studies. All studies were conducted in the Pharmacy Simulation Center at Laval University, which comprises 10 pharmacy stations that are representative of community pharmacy in Quebec. The pharmacies are equipped with real medications, electronic patient records, telephones, compounding and dispensing material, etc. And the study population was made up of undergraduate pharmacy students that study in a 4-year competency-based program that leads to pharmacy practice in the province of Quebec. For our first study, we investigated the effect of the learning environment on novices' cognitive load, emotions, and learning experience using different questionnaires and focus group interviews. We compared 2 types of environments: an immersive simulation requiring a fully functioning physical environment, and simulated patient, where the physical environment plays a very limited role in the scenario, if any. In this study, we found that the physical environment in which students perform a task plays an important role in what they will ultimately learn. Immersive simulation is more challenging and more stressful for novices because they're still getting used to this pharmacy environment. Students, they even told us that in immersive simulation, whenever they felt overloaded, they sometimes consciously chose to focus on one aspect of the scenario and ignore other aspects. Now, interestingly, what they focus on might not be fully in line with our objectives behind the scenario. For our second study, we examined the effect of task complexity on students' cognitive load, performance, and perception of learning, using once again questionnaires and this time individual interviews. So we compared simple versus complex learning tasks in immersive simulation, but this time the environment remained unchanged. Now, without a surprise, students were more challenged by complex tasks compared to simpler tasks. So when performing a simple task, students, they tend to feel more confident, more self-assured about their capacity, but they also were less interested during the debriefing to learn what they could improve for future practice. Now, on the contrary, when performing a complex task, students were undoubtedly challenged and they tried to be strategic to work around their struggles. And usually they are aware when their performance is under standards. And they're very curious to reflect on their performance during the debriefing and learn what they could have done better. For our third study, we modulated both task and environment complexity. So we had simple task versus complex tasks in simple versus complex environments. And we used questionnaires and to measure cognitive load and video recordings to measure students' performance. Interestingly, students never experienced cognitive overload and maintained a rather good level of performance, even though some of them faced very complex situations. In fact, performance does not decrease consistently as complexity increases. For example, in complex environments, even if the task becomes more complex, their performance doesn't decrease as expected. Once again, This shows that students are strategic and they know how to restrain their focus to certain aspects of the situation to try to maintain a good level of performance. So what do we learn so far from these 3 studies? In immersive simulation, the environment and the task are equally important in the scenario and can both influence students' experience. They both relate to the learning goals of the simulation and are not just accessories. Therefore, they both need attention when it comes to design. Novices, they tend to choose where they invest their efforts in simulation when they're facing struggles. So they make their decision, consciously or not, based on their personal preferences. Now, they may be strategic, but it doesn't mean that their strategy aligns with our intentions as educators. Therefore, we must be able to predict their struggles, anticipate their strategy, and adapt the scenario so that they're not too diverted from the learning goal. And as I said earlier, not all students actively perform in a simulation. Sometimes students observe their peer perform. In our last study focuses on understanding how we can stimulate learning from observation using different tools to support observers' role. So for our last study, we compared collaboration scripts versus checklists in terms of cognitive load and learning outcomes for observers using questionnaires and focus group interviews. Now, collaboration scripts are key clinical tips that students were told to observe and discuss with a peer during the simulation, whereas checklists are a list of actions to check whenever they are performed by their peer. Now, we found that providing support for observers in simulation, regardless of its form, engaged them with the simulation and guided their focus. Checklists were considered simpler to use than collaboration scripts from students' perspective, but were probably not promoting learning as much because students felt that the answers were already listed. With collaboration scripts, students felt encouraged to reflect in depth on one aspect of the scenario. So the question here is not, whether being an observer or an active participant in the simulation is better, but rather how can we make the most out of the observer's experience? Novices, perhaps even more than experts, appreciate being observers, specifically when they're supported in their role. More importantly, novices like to observe occasionally because they don't have a performance anxiety. Their perspective is different, but it doesn't mean that it's not meaningful. So in closing, I will leave you with some key takeaways from this research. Immersive simulation is a powerful learning experience for novices if the task and the environment are carefully designed and aligned with the learning goals. For me, designing a simulation is just like directing a play. The designer or the director must plan every aspect of the scenario. The script of the patient, the stage decor, whether lighting and sounds are important, and whether it should be recorded or not. Will there be an audience? And if so, who will they be? And what will they do during the simulation? Are they allowed to interact, or should they just stay silent and watch the scene unfold? So it's all about finding the right balance between all these features in order to create the impact intended with the scene and stimulate the right conversations. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. With that, I will stop sharing my screen and be ready to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your clear summary of your thesis. Thank you. The opposition will be opened by Professor Jeroen van Merijenboer. He is Professor in Learning and Instruction at Maastricht University. Professor van Merijenboer.
Thank you, co-rector. Dear candidates, let me first congratulate you with completing this PhD thesis. I really enjoyed reading it. It is concise, very well readable, and also about an important topic. Still, I do have some questions. My first question is about different ways to manage cognitive load. And I think we both agree that managing cognitive load in learning is very important. Simply said, there are two ways to manage cognitive load. We can do it as an instructional designer by manipulating the task or the environment in which learning takes place. By simplifying the environment or simplifying the task, we decrease cognitive load, at least intrinsic cognitive load, and we hope that this will have positive effects on the learning process. This is what I call first-order scaffolding. But there is also something called second-order scaffolding. And the reason that there is also second-order scaffolding is that cognitive load cannot only be managed by the instructional designer or the teacher, but it can also be managed by the student, him or herself. Self-management of cognitive load. And when we train self-management of cognitive load, we help our students to develop strategies that they can use to manage their cognitive load. Mm-hmm. When I look at your studies, you seem to be mainly interested in first-order scaffolding, in simplifying the task and simplifying the environment in order to improve the learning process. But the fascinating thing is that in your results, you also address the self-management of cognitive load. And in several of your studies, we see that students who are confronted with the more complex environments or more complex tasks are using strategies to lower their cognitive load. They focus more on the environment and data collection, and they focus less on problem solving and clinical reasoning. Mm-hmm. My first question is this really a meaningful finding? Or is this merely indicating a lack of experimental control in your experiment? You could also say, well, this is a failed experiment because I tried to manage students' cognitive load, but because I was not successful, students have to do it themselves. Mm-hmm. So this is my first question. And personally, I think that in the ideal experiment, we must be able to disentangle the effects of external management of cognitive load and self-management of cognitive load. And do you agree with me? And if so, how could you design future studies in order to figure out what the added value of self-management of cognitive load is? So I'm looking forward to your ideas about this.
Thank you. Thank you, highly esteemed opponent, for your question. I fully agree with you that it takes two to tango in that situation, right? So, and as a designer, I do have some control over what I will, provide to my students as educators, as an education, but they also have a control in managing their own cognitive load. I wouldn't say that this is a failed experiment. I think that this was an interesting finding because I was expecting that they would do something, but I didn't know exactly what they did. And I think that the qualitative aspects of my research helped me understand better that, yes, they weren't overloaded, but what was actually happening was, something relevant for me. And considering my study didn't really focus on the content of debriefing, but, managing cognitive load is also something that they will have to ultimately do in the future as clinicians, right? Because they might face pretty difficult situations and they'll ultimately have to make sure that they address the right problems. So considering that managing cognitive load might even be a hidden agenda of simulation, I think they have to develop these coping mechanisms. And as educators, how I can address their management of cognitive load could be during debriefing, because when we're analyzing what's going on, then we have access to how they actually process the situation and why they made this and that decision. Usually this comes up during the debriefing. And as a facilitator, I think it would be my duty to address that and help understand whether this was a good strategy or not. If so, how can we use that in the future? And if not, how can I help that? Or how can other people help them find other strategies to cope with complexity in the future? So I guess perhaps in the future, as future studies, to address the second part of your question.
Well, maybe I can first, before we go to the second part of the question, ask you an additional question. Mm-hmm. Because the strategy they are using refocusing from problem solving and clinical reasoning to data collection in a complex environment is not a very good strategy, I would say. We would probably prefer them to use more effective strategies to deal with the cognitive load, still focusing on the clinical reasoning and problem solving process. So again, my question is, isn't this an undesirable effect of your experimental manipulations? Couldn't you have designed your experimental manipulations in such a way that students were at least told to focus on one specific learning objective and maybe have been given some more effective strategies than moving away from the clinical reasoning?
Yeah, I understand your point of view. I am still not considering that as an undesirable effect, because I thought that, well, that's the purpose of immersive simulation, right? You want them to be able to deal with all these aspects at the same time. The simulation curriculum, is embedded in a whole program where they are taken from the most simple tasks to the more complex ones. And simulation comes at a certain point where they have, prior knowledge and they have experienced simpler tasks that didn't involve an environment, for example. Whereas, so you're using simulation so that they're able to do both, to deal with both aspects, so the task and the environment at the same time before they actually do that in practice. So I guess it's a bonus that they can do that in simulation. Otherwise, they wouldn't probably have simulation and they would go straight to clinical practice and would probably have the same strategy to try to ignore environmental aspects or, divert their focus from the clinical task. So that would have probably happened, but this time in the workplace. Hopefully, perhaps the preceptor would have caught that and helped them with that. But I guess that's the beauty of simulation, that it provides an additional experience in specifically time to discuss what happened, which is probably not always the case in the workplace, considering the workload and what they have to deal with. So I guess for future studies, I would be interested in how during debriefing we are discussing that. We actually did in practice, but that wasn't the focus of the research. This is why this wasn't comprised in the thesis.
Yeah, but would this future research also enable you to disentangle the effects of management of cognitive load by the designer of the task and the environment and the management of cognitive load by the students?
You may give a short answer, please.
Yeah, or would you simply treat self-management of cognitive load as a dependent variable?
Yeah, perhaps I would focus more on the second order scaffolding, whereas the first order would probably be more, educator controlled. So perhaps focus on the design of the task. And as I said, the two combines so that learning occurs. So I'd probably focus on the second order during debriefing.
Okay, thank you. Then I'll give the word back to the co-rector.
Thank you, Professor van Merrienboer. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Marleen Groenier. She is Assistant Professor in Professional Learning in High-Tech Healthcare at the University of Twente in the Netherlands. Dr. Groenier.
Thank you, co-rector. Dear candidates, first of all, congratulations on the scientific work you have done and you presented today. In your studies, you carefully describe, explain, manipulate, and analyze various aspects of simulation education that can aid in setting the right scene for learners. You compare designing simulation education with directing a play in a theater. The simulation being the play, the learners the actors, the scenario the scene, and peers the supporting actors. In your words, the decor, the lighting, the intensity of the supporting actors, and the sonic environment serve the purpose of the scene. You unravel these scenes to see how each aspect might contribute or not to achieving the intended learning goals. I noticed that in your work, the spotlight is on the learners and the role they play in simulation. Among others, you examine the emotional impact of a simulation on a learner, the effect of task complexity on the learner's cognitive load, and the impact of instructional support on learning outcomes. And like a theater director, a simulation designer needs to pay attention to all these interacting details for learning to happen, something that you also demonstrate in your studies. But although you pay attention to many details, I feel that one supporting role should be in the spotlight more, the role of the instructor. I have checked it in your dissertation. Learners are mentioned 20 times more often than instructors. Even though on page 84 of your dissertation, you report that first and foremost, instructors benefit from your research before students. So this makes me wonder, in your opinion, should the simulation instructor have a leading role, a supporting role, or is it only considered to be an extra? Could you reflect on the role of the instructor in simulation education a bit more and taking your own experiences as simulation instructor into account? I would love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you for that question, esteemed opponent. It's actually very interesting. I guess I would have to. I would probably make a distinction between the designer and the instructor, because the designer would be the one to really design the scenario, set the table for that, but might not always be the one facilitating the debriefing. So I guess the instructional part probably refers more to the designer and help designer improve their scenario in the future. Instructors, for me, would not have the leading role, because simulation-based for me is really student-centered, and it's all about answering their own learning goals when we are providing an opportunity to discuss for that. So I like the word facilitator for a debriefer, because I like that he facilitates conversation because of his experience, but also because of his expertise as a debriefer. Doesn't have to be an expert in the field, but has to be someone who's able to make the implicit explicit. So I guess that would probably be a supporting role in my view, but definitely not a leading role, considering that for me, the spotlight's on the students and it's their opportunity to learn.
Okay, thank you. That's very informative. So, for example, suppose I'm one of those facilitators. What kind of stage directions would you give to me to facilitate this debriefing?
So aside from a thorough training that you would have to go through to be able to, ask the right questions and at the right time, specifically related to a scenario, I would first and foremost tell you all about the learning objectives we had in mind when we designed the scenario. Sometimes we have surprises and we realize that, what happens, there are a lot of emergent objectives that we can't potentially anticipate, but that sometimes emerge as the students perform the task. So we have to be aware of what they will ultimately do. So I would first tell you about the learning objectives I had in mind, but perhaps tell you to have an open mind and see what they're actually doing. Perhaps they have emergent objectives they want to talk about, and they might even, be more important than the ones we had in mind. And if so, then we'd have to, address the ones in the future. So I guess it's, yes, be prepared, know what you're going to talk about, but, be aware of what students actually want to learn and need to learn, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you mentioned some of the training for instructors. So what should I think about? Is it something that comes naturally to some of these facilitators, or is this something that you would make more explicit?
Some people are definitely more natural at this, but for me, instinct isn't enough to be a good debriefer. You would definitely have to first make sure that you know the modality. It's not a really, it's not, if you haven't been trained in simulation, this is something that's probably new to you. So you definitely need to know what to expect and how to formulate the proper questions so that students explicit what they have in mind, so that you don't only focus on what you saw, but what they had in mind that led to what you saw. So so you'd have to know how to formulate the right questions, perhaps also how to structure the debriefing so that you would go through every important aspects up to the emotional aspects of it and the analytical part of it, and even tricks to tips to be able to transfer learning in the future. So this definitely requires a bit of training, although some people have it more naturally than others.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that brings me to my next point, because you mentioned that the debriefing part and about the intended learning goals. Should there be a pre-briefing as well, and maybe an instructor-led pre-briefing? Is that something that, on the basis of your results from your studies, would you argue would be beneficial for the learning outcomes?
Oh, yes. For me, I know I mostly talked about the scenario and the debriefing as it's, takes most of the time, but pre-briefing and briefing are very important as well, so that you establish, a mutual contract with your students, that they know what to expect, so that you establish also a bit of psychological safety, so that they know it's a safe environment to learn. And so that your goal is not for them to be surprised by everything. You don't want to, to put them in a position that they cannot succeed. So during the pre-briefing, sometimes you even, explain how the environment works if something new in the environment happens. This wasn't the case well, we do have a pre-briefing. This wasn't really, the focus of my research, but this also has to accompany a good simulation session so that your students, as well as you, have, everything you need for learning to occur.
We have to move on to the next opponent.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Pro-Rector.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Walter Eppich. He is Professor of Simulation Education at Maastricht University, and he is also affiliated with the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, Dublin. Professor Eppich.
Thank you so much. So, dear candidate, thank you so much for your wonderful research program. I learned so much reading your series of studies, which I think everyone would recognize were published very highly in very impactful journals. And I think that's a testament to the rigor of the work. And I also would love to congratulate your supervisors in mentoring you through this body of work. Much like the other opponents, I too have questions. And I know that the prior opponent touched on issues related to simulation educator training. And as you yourself highlighted, there are issues of design and issues of implementation. As someone who runs a large simulation program with undergraduate students from medicine, pharmacy, physiotherapy, nursing, and facilitators from all levels of training, I'm wondering specifically what you would recommend to me and to my team in terms of translating and integrating your main findings into our upcoming simulation educator training events and programs.
Right. Okay. Thank you, highly esteemed opponent, for your question. So, of course, my studies were designed for pharmacy students, but I do believe that there are things that you can probably take and implement in other disciplines, because a novice is a novice, right? So perhaps, for nutritionists, the environment is not the same than in pharmacy, but they definitely do not know the environment in which they will, evolve as a professional. So for them, I think the fact that everything is new and everything is important is the same. So I would guess that for your training, for your facilitators and educators in your programs, the first thing would be to know your population, try to anticipate their expertise level. And if they're very, very novice, then allow some time for them to, just, feel the room and be in the environment before providing any type of, complexity or challenge. The environment itself is so new to them that the task they can probably manage, before, while doing PBL or other types of educations. But, immersive simulation is really the time when they combine it all, just before they go into clinical rotations. So the environment is really crucial for very novice. So when you're designing a scenario, make sure that they have some time to manage it. Perhaps allow, for longer cases and for more repetition of the same type of complexity, so that they master a little bit the environment. Also, because I think it's good to start with a simple task so that it gives you a little bit more confidence in your capacity, so that you're able to deal with more challenge at the same afterwards. So start with really simple tasks in really simple environments and allow for some time, to master it all.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I think, very specifically, one of the things that jumped out at me in reading your thesis was this roadmap or blueprint for creating complexity, attending to issues of simplicity or complexity, both for the task and for the environment. And I'm wondering, how would you, if I were a physiotherapy educator, how would you recommend that I take those generalized lessons and help apply them in my own environment as a design exercise? What would your recommendation be?
So the blueprint for me was very useful because it was a way for me to put into, on paper, the theory behind, complexity. And I also had in mind not to lose authenticity, because sometimes there's like this shortcut that we make, right? We try to oversimplify things, but we lose its essence, and it doesn't really make sense. So it doesn't really transfer into learning because it's not. So that blueprint, I think, was helpful for that. So if you're from another discipline, I think the exercise that you would have to make is to keep in mind that you need to remain authentic, but the information that you need to deal with has to be, either simple or more intense if you're in either simple or complex environment or task. So I guess this is what guided my reflection when I came up with the blueprint as to how is it authentic, but has less information within.
So I just have one final sort of follow-up on this same topic related to the figure 1 with the blueprint for the design. I had an idea about how I might integrate it into my simulation educator development, and I'd love to get your thoughts if you think that would make sense. So in my mind, I'm really into co-design and bringing in educational experts from different specialties. And the exercise I'm envisioning is presenting the blueprint and then having educators from the different domains workshop what they think is simple and complex, and then manipulate those things, at least task complexity versus environmental complexity. That's just an idea. I'm not the expert in this, you are. So I'm wondering what you think about that.
I think it's a great idea. The more I also am a lot into the co-construction. I think that the people that you need to call needs to be reminded of the level of your students, because it's sometimes experts, they don't remember how they were before they started. So, and that's kind of a surprise for them sometimes when they design something, they have in mind that this is so simple, but it isn't. So they have to be reminded of the modality of your students' level. And I think that perhaps, but while talking with each other, they're going to be, aware of that. But I think that's the tricky part, so that you choose carefully the people.
Thank you so much, dear candidate. Best of luck to you.
Thank you, Professor Eppich. The next opponent is Professor Roger Renneberg. He is Professor of Internal Medicine and Medical Education at Maastricht University. Professor Renneberg.
Thank you, Pro-Rector. And dear candidate, I also want to extend my congratulations to you and also to your promoters with a fine, concise, good readable, well-readable thesis. And it changed my view of pharmacists a little bit, I must say. I didn't know they had so much interaction with patients until I read your thesis. And I was very thrilled by the complexity that you added in your research. For example, handwritten prescriptions, computers that don't help, confusion information. I think that's something that we should add also in our skills. I know it's already there in some form, but I was really thrilled to read about it and to see how you make tasks that look rather simple, very complex. Of course, like the other ones, I have some questions. One, for example, regarding chapter 3, where you investigate the difference in learning from simple versus complex tasks. Where simple stimulates confidence, complex stimulates reflection. I think both are important, but it also suggests another important principle about optimal learning. The task should connect optimal to previous knowledge. Do you agree with me that if this connection is met, we would get the best of both worlds of confidence and learning? What do you feel about that? How do you feel about that?
Very, very interesting question. Thank you, highly esteemed opponent, for that question. Of course, it's important to build on previous learning. I think it's one of the basic design principles that have been proven many times before. So I would, I wouldn't use immersive simulation for such novice learners without them at least mastering the clinical content. So when we designed the simulation in chapter 3, they had the prior knowledge, the clinical prior knowledge at least, for both simple and complex tasks. What they didn't have is experience, though. And I was also surprised by the fact that, when they performed well, it's like they thought that they had it all and they didn't really need to learn more, although they could have improved a little bit. We can always do better, right? But they didn't seem to be that interested. They needed the challenge. So I do agree that building on prior knowledge is really important. I think it's not that, within one task, you can promote both. Yes, perhaps. I think what's been proven effective in simulation is to provide a wide range of, complexity, so that they have opportunities to feel good about themselves and have opportunities to go deeper into one aspect. And I think it's a combination of both that can help, perhaps not within one task, but within the session, so that they, develop many skills and many, aspects of their professional training.
Yeah, and if you look at the tasks you have, if they are not too complex and not too simple, do you expect that reflection still adds something extra?
Yes, I think we should expect that. And that's also the strength of debriefing. I think that this is where, when you know that your students did well, there's always, a way during debriefing to go a little deeper and to stimulate other types of situations. We use recontextualization, for example, and to go deeper and see how what they did good in that performance can be applied to other similar or dissimilar situations. So there's always room for going deeper. And I think that's when you need your debriefer skills to make the most out of these situations.
Yeah, I think the next chapter 4, answers some of the questions already, where you investigate the debriefing. And I was wondering, is it really debriefing, or is it just the extra time spent on the problem? Because when you add extra things to education, it's also extra time you spend, which also gives learning. And is it specifically the debriefing part, or is it just spending more time thinking about it?
It's probably a combination of both. But a debriefing has been, when you give extra time, you don't always know what they are going to do with it. But when you debrief, you have a little bit more control on what's going on. So a good debriefing can probably help them go a little deeper with the task and learn more from it. So, but of course, if they have more time to practice, then it's another opportunity to learn. It's just a different one.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I was also interested in chapter 5, although not significant in quantitative analysis. I got the impression that collaboration scripts are perceived as a positive way of learning in a qualitative analysis. They were very positive about it. And I was thinking, do you think this is the way to go if you would want to expand our programmatic assessment, as we are now developing in Maastricht, to skills lab tests? Should we use this technique?
Collaboration scripts?
Yeah.
Well, for me, collaboration scripts were implemented mostly to stimulate learning from observation, because, some observations, sometimes when you don't give them any guidance, they will observe and perhaps provide feedback to their peer, but will not be, in the position of the learner. And I wanted to stimulate that. So for me, this was really from a learner's perspective and not necessarily from an assessment perspective, although you could probably use that in another context. I'm sure there's a lot of interesting thing that could be done with that. But the way I used it was to make sure that the observer was stimulated and engaged more, and was not just observing for observation's sake, but just for his own learning, which seemed to be the case, as our students told us during the qualitative interviews. So, yeah.
Thank you very much for your answer. I'll give the word back to the co-lector.
Thank you, Professor Renneberg. The next opponent is Professor Laurens Stasse. He is professor in gastrointestinal surgery, in particular training and education at Maastricht University. Professor Stassen.
Thank you, Rector, for giving me the word. And it's an honor for me to address you, dear candidate, although I'm not allowed to pronounce your name and to address you as Marie-Laurence, but you may see that my first name is about the same, although it's pronounced a bit differently. So it's nice to pronounce it. Well, anyway, dear candidate, it's a pity that we can't meet live because you in Canada have a very fascinating world. I want to compliment you on the thorough work you did, which up to now you illustrated also by your thorough answers, I think. One very short question to start up with. At page 101, you mentioned that you use, or there are about over 100 scenarios. Did I understand that right? That you in your pharmacy education curriculum use nowadays so many scenarios? And are these all immersive simulation scenarios?
So yeah, thank you for your question. Yes, we do have over 100 scenarios we can use within our simulation curriculum. Our students, they do simulation every semester for over the 4 year of their program. So they come pretty often in the simulation lab. So yeah, we have more than 100 simulation scenario designed to help them develop their clinical skills.
Well, that's impressive. I think that we could, even on this simple point of the number of scenarios, we could learn from you. But maybe we can even learn more. I want to discuss two general things. It's about debriefing and it's about observing. Let's start with debriefing, already addressed by Professor Renneberg. You stress at several points in your thesis that this is an intrinsic and important part of immersive simulation. If the simulation itself maybe doesn't offer the optimal learning experience, the debriefing can add value to that. Or as you mentioned in chapter 3 and in the discussion, simpler tasks help students gain self-confidence, while complex tasks encourage reflective practice during debriefings. I think that's a very important remark. And I want to make a parallel to education in clinical practice or even maybe surgery. Every trainee in the Netherlands and all around the world, I think, has a training portfolio, a digital portfolio, which is supposed to be filled continuously with feedback on previous performance. And we do have structured assessment of technical skills, but also assessment of other clinical activities. Do you have that system as well in your pharmacy training?
Something similar, but yeah, they do have digital portfolios they have to fill out, as well as a reflective part that's also very informative.
Yeah, and candidates are required to ask for feedback. How does that feedback work in practice, in your practice? Does it resemble a bit the debriefing that you have described in your studies?
That's actually a good point. Thank you, highly esteemed opponent. For me, there's a distinction that needs to be made between feedback and debriefing. Feedback can be quite short, as debriefing can be, but is usually can be a conversation, but usually you comment on what you saw, the performance. You ask some questions to your students. Students can also be, can contribute to the debriefing. And if the feedback is good, then perhaps we can even provide solutions for future practice. That would be debriefing. That would be feedback. Sorry, debriefing. A cognitive debriefing goes a little deeper. You might want to comment on the performance, but what you're really interested in is the reflection that led to the performance. Why that the person did something that way? Because it might be interesting to know sometimes people do very good things, but they don't really know why they did that. And on the contrary, they did bad performance, but they had good intentions, and they had, part of the reflection that was correct. But at the end, for example, perhaps their plan wasn't good enough, so they didn't, perform as you expected. So a cognitive debriefing would try to tackle that reference guide that they have in their mind, to make it explicit and understand why did they actually do something that way. And if you're only doing feedback, you might not have the opportunity to go in depth in that. So I think both are complementary. We do have both feedback and debriefing during our simulation session. Unfortunately, we are not able to provide, debriefing for our digital portfolio, although for us, the way we use it might not be the same, purpose. So I guess it's okay that we don't have the opportunity to do debriefing, but I think debriefing the way we do it can be definitely helpful for preceptors in the clinical work that can, go a little deeper than aside from just commenting what they saw, and be a little bit more interested in why they saw what they saw with their discussion with their students.
Well, you make an interesting distinction between feedback and debriefing, cognitive debriefing, you call it. Well, do you recognize the situation that the supervisor says, well, we've now done this operation, or we have together been in this clinical contact. You write down in your clinical portfolio, digital portfolio, what you think about it, and send it open to me, or send it to me, and then I can approve of it. And maybe he or she has said, I will give some extra suggestions, but in practice, it does happen that the only thing the supervisor does is sign it digitally, sign the reflection of the student. Just that. Do you recognize that? And do you think that's a proper kind of feedback, debriefing?
Well, I wonder if it's feedback altogether, because, I guess if we saw something that's really out of the ordinary and that needed to be addressed, I'm sure clinicians would probably intervene in some way, but everything in the middle would probably, go without, any further comment. And I'm not sure. I think that there's a missed opportunity perhaps for learning there. So, just reading and signing might not be enough for feedback. I'd be interested to know a little bit more about what they need to maintain, what they should improve, and why, and how is this helpful. So
are you being very polite by saying it might not be enough?
Yeah, perhaps. Okay. Let me be a little clearer. It's not enough, I guess, for feedback. It doesn't, for me, it's might not be feedback at all. It's just kind of approval.
Well, I think you've gone a long way, and you've reached far by having 100 scenarios, but having this simulation lab, and I see that still supervisors and faculty are struggling with dealing with this new environment, with the modern world, and indeed taking the opportunity to provide proper feedback. And I agree completely with you that the way I described it is not proper feedback. Well, actually, I would love to discuss much more with you, but I see a physical signal from the pro-rector, which means that I have to hand over the word to the next opponent.
Thank you very much, Professor Stassen. The next opponent is Dr. Esther Giroldi. She is Assistant Professor in Doctor-Patient Communication at the Department of Family Medicine of Maastricht University. Dr. Giroldi.
Thank you, Pro-Rector. Dear candidates, first of all, I would also like to congratulate you and your team on completing this important work on the role of immersive simulation in medical education. As you probably know, at Maastricht University, we have a long-standing tradition with using simulation in our medical program. And one well-known example is the communication skills program, in which students practice their communication skills with simulated patients and reflect upon their videotaped consultations during supervised group sessions. And I'm glad that I recognize some of your findings and recommendations about how to adjust task complexity and the environment, and how this communication skills program is built. And as we know, learning complex competencies such as communication involve a longitudinal process of repeated practice and reflection. And simulation has proven to be a very powerful tool in this learning process. My first question is, when we look closely at how we should design the simulation and the debriefing, is there, based on your findings and views, a difference between the more hard objective skills such as clinical reasoning and performing technical procedures, and on the other side, the more soft subjective skills such as communication?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understood your question. I think we have a small gap. Could you please repeat the question?
Sure. So in your view, is there, based on your findings and views, a difference between the more like hard objective skills, such as clinical reasoning and performing technical procedures, and the more subjective or soft skills, such as communication? So when we look at how we design the simulation, or is the difference more in the debriefing parts?
I guess the first thing I would say is that it all comes back to choosing the simulation modality, right? There are many simulation modalities out there. And when you choose one, well, you have objectives in mind. If you want to practice technical skills, you would go with more procedural simulation. If you want to practice communication skills and clinical reasoning, then you have many possibilities. And I think you need to be conscious whether or not the environment is important in your learning, to achieve your learning goals. If the environment is not important, then doing a simulated patient only without an environment is definitely okay, because you're probably going to reach your goal more faster because you won't have the environment to consider, to design, and that won't be a source of distraction. I think so. The principles behind my research apply regardless of the type of skills, but the choice that you have to make is whether you need to make it immersive or not. And if you choose to go immersion, then it's because you consider that the environment will be important and will affect the way you will perform the task. So I think that would be the distinction I'd make.
Yeah, clear. Thank you. While simulation in medical communication training has clearly taken its place in the undergraduate medical program, research has also shown a deterioration of student skills in the clinical phase of the medical training. In your research, you really focus on undergraduate level, but yeah, we see that during the clinical rotations, for instance, and also later on in the postgraduate level during medical specialty training, for example, communication skills may deteriorate. So the transfer of skills learned from training to practice has appeared to be problematic. Could you reflect upon the role of immersive simulation during this phase of the medical program, so the clinical stages of the medical program, during which students and residents already work in practice and see real patients, and how should we integrate immersive simulation with these real-life clinical experiences?
Great, thank you for your question, esteemed opponent. The way we actually do it in our curriculum is students, they actually do that, right? They do immersive simulation, then they go into clinical rotations, then they come back to school, and then they have other simulations. So we do have that mix of immersion and clinical exposure. Simulation-based education is something you can use from the earlier stage of your training to, throughout your professional life. I think there's a value for that. And you probably, when you're more advanced in your training and you're more expert, then you probably need to go with just-in-time training when you see that there's something that happened in the clinical practice, perhaps an incident you need to address, and this might be a call for developing a simulation that would address that problem. So for me, there's room for that for sure, and I can imagine that if you're training on your clinical skills at some point and you never do in the future, that you could probably observe skills decay, right? So there should probably be, I'm unfamiliar with the exact delay for each skills that you would need to, but I would imagine that for communication skills, you'd need to, go through sometimes trainings to just review the basics that you could probably forget while you're working as a professional. So, to make sure that you prevent skills decay, I would definitely integrate some source of simulation throughout your professional life and more advanced students, medical students.
Okay, thank you. I think we're out of time. So I'll give 5 more minutes. Okay. And how to deal with, because in a later stage of the medical career, postgraduates, for instance, they may be a bit more skeptical towards working with simulated patients when they already have real life experiences. What are your views on that? How to deal with this?
Good point. I think you have to accept that. And then once the case is started, perhaps, this will all go away, specifically if you have trained actors that are really professional in their role and they never, they stay in role. Usually after the first task, they're still engaged. They're engaged.
Thank you.
Mrs. Tremblay, I hope you have noticed that the time for defending your thesis has passed. The committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and in particular the quality of your defense. And I request you to remain until we have returned with the results of our deliberation. I think everybody is back. Mrs. Tremblay, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. And in view of this positive verdict, and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Dolmans is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university law and custom. I invite now your supervisor to take the floor. Professor Dolmans.
Dear candidate, before I hand over the diploma, I would ask you a question. So here is the question. Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
I do.
Okay, so it's my honor that body authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Marie-Laurence Tremblay, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I or the pedal will present you with a degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university. Thank you, Fidel. I now give the word to Professor Jan-Joost Rattens.
Please unmute Jan-Joost.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute. So thank you very much, Diana. Dear Marie-Laurence, Dr. Marie-Laurence, lights, camera, action. And now here's the debrief after your clear presentation and good defense. First of all, I would like, and of course also on behalf of Diana, to congratulate you with this very fine result. A very good performance today, a PhD at Maastricht University with 4 already published papers. This result really counts in the medical education society worldwide. Well done. And I'd also like to extend our congratulations to your husband, Alexander, co-author of the 2 of your papers, and to the parents of both of you. You all have many reasons to be proud of Marie-Laurence, and Marie-Laurence, you can be proud too. With your papers, you helped educators to really think very good beforehand about how to design a simulation scenario from which students will optimally learn. You help them to think carefully about the subtle balance needed between the environment and the complexity of a case. And you also showed us how inventive novice students are. As we learned, they take sometimes shortcuts during scenarios that not always were planned by the educators, but that gave them as students yet the best possible result. And I think your comparison with designing a play in a theater is indeed very instructive too. In your booklet, in the section about the author, you described yourself that in addition to being a researcher, you are a mom, a wife, a daughter, and a friend. I like that phrase. You forget to mention, however, that you're also a person who likes to go on unusual pathways, like changing your career from firstly working as a community pharmacist, then changing to a position as a hospital pharmacist in an intensive care unit, and subsequently again followed by starting a career in medical education at SHE. And by today, even with a PhD degree, something that is unusual for a Canadian pharmacist. So, from firstly being during your undergraduate studies the president of the Pharmacy Student Association of your university, you now made it to a professorship as chair of the educational leadership in community pharmacy education at Laval University. What a career, and you only just started. You started together with your husband at SHE with a master in health professional education as early in 2014, and thereafter planned to do this PhD and started with it in January 2016. And although obviously it may seem to an outsider that your career went completely smoothly, the contrary was the case, as these years were not easy at all for you. You gave birth to two beautiful daughters, first to Sarah Jeanne in 2017, a premature birth at 33 weeks, with all the stress that belongs to such a life event, like a very fast drive to the nearest hospital, with a baby born there within 1 hour, followed by 1 month at a neonatal ICU. And secondly, you got Romy in 2020, with a full hospital delivery again. And of course, little children get sick very often in their first years, always at moments you do not want them to get sick, like when you needed to work for this research. And during this PhD process too, you had to deal with 2.5 years of COVID, with all its delays and barriers that hindered your projects. And in addition, there were unsuspected personal changes in your guiding team, leading you to need to become a very fast and expert in statistics too, and you managed. All these drawbacks made you thus stronger, wishing to continue and using every possible moment to work on your projects, even with kids on your lap during computer work, or with them playing under the desk of your office. And you organized help with your husband, your parents, and from your nanny, Janet. And I'm sure Diane and I have not prepared you an easy road during your PhD. We were always pushing you to the best, sometimes to the limits maybe. And I think Diana sometimes even more than I. I hope that you were or are aware that we did not do this only to bully you, not to bully you. We didn't want to do this. No, we did this as we noticed that from the start on how very good you are at doing research, how well you are in receiving constructive feedback, and we wanted to help you to get the best possible start for the rest of your career in Canada. And I think we succeeded. Marie-Laurence, it was a great pleasure and privilege for us to work with you. And if you ever want to improve your Dutch language skills, more than just to order a cup of coffee, please feel free to visit us in Maastricht again to help you again. We wish you all the best in the rest of your life. Thank you very much, or in Dutch, hartelijk dank. And I give the word back to the pro-rector.
Esteemed Dr. Tremblay, dear Marie-Laurence, it's my great pleasure to congratulate you with your doctorate. And I congratulate you also on behalf of the Board of Deans of Maastricht University. And I would like to share some impressions of the committee with you. Well, first of all, we have seen a very clear summary of your thesis. And your thesis itself has been well and concisely written on interesting topics. And you made a careful analysis of complex issues. And the studies are well published. In your defense, we saw an expert in the field, someone who really showed the conditions of designing simulations. And you have shown to be very knowledgeable of your field. Of course, we have also seen and heard some general answers, and in particular on debriefing, but we consider that not as really the heart of your studies. So we are very satisfied with your defense. And I would like to congratulate also your two supervisors, Professor Diana Dolmans and Professor Jan-Joost Redhans. Congratulations with the result that we have seen today in the form of a very well-written thesis, beautiful studies, and a good defense. So congratulations with this result. And of course, I include in my congratulations your husband and your family, your children and your parents. And of course, I would like to include in my congratulations all your colleagues and friends and all those people who have contributed to the studies of your thesis. And of course, I wish you a very successful professional career and a happy personal life. And I would also like to thank all the members of both the assessment committee and of the degree committee Thank you very much for critically reading the manuscript, but also to have interesting questions and a good scientific discussion. And I would like to thank in particular the external members of the both committees. Thank you very much. Maastricht University appreciates your contributions. Before I close this academic ceremony, I would like to ask the members of the degree committee to stay online, and we will have the opportunity to congratulate you on behalf of the committee. So stay online, and hereby I close this academic ceremony at Maastricht University. I think now